Christos Anesti. Dear brothers and sisters, today, the third Sunday of Great and Holy Pascha, the Holy Orthodox Church commemorates the holy Myrrh-bearing Women and the holy righteous Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. We heard in the Gospel reading how Joseph of Arimathea and the Myrrh-bearing Women displayed great faithfulness and service in the face of adversity. We heard how after Jesus was crucified, the people in Jerusalem were in an uproar. People witnessed the earthquake. They saw the sun covered. They felt that something drastic had happened. And those who crucified Jesus were out also to put to death the followers of Jesus. It was a dangerous place. And despite all of this, Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, the very Sanhedrin that voted to condemn Jesus to death, took courage and went to Pilate and asked to take the body of Jesus away and bury it. That was the custom of the Jews. He risked everything. He risked being expelled from the synagogue. He risked being expelled from the Sanhedrin. Being a member of the Sanhedrin was quite an accomplishment, a lifelong struggle for him. Struggle with works of faith, but also prayerfulness and study. He gained the respect of many people in his society, and he risked losing all of that. Now, for us in the modern world, it's difficult to understand the consequences. If we're expelled from church, most people would say, so what? But antiquity, if you're expelled from the synagogue, which was the foundation of society of the Jews, you were expelled from society. You're an outcast. And the same was also in early Christianity. If you were excommunicated, or if you left the church, you left society. You left your supports. You lost your income. So Nicodemus, or Joseph of Arimathea, took upon himself great risk because he was faithful to Christ. The Myrrh-bearing Women. The Myrrh-bearing Women followed Jesus likewise over many of the 3 years of his ministry, along with the disciples. They too saw the miracles. They too heard the message of Jesus. And at the crucifixion, they saw not only their master being put to death and tormented and humiliated, but worse yet, they saw their companions, their fellow followers of Christ, the disciples of Jesus, flee, abandon Jesus. Even Peter, the rock. Most people would likewise follow what everyone else is doing. But the Myrrh-bearing Women didn't, and they held fast, strong to their faith. And they likewise stood at the cross to the very end, when everyone else abandoned Jesus. And then early on the first day of the week, on Sunday, the day of the resurrection, they came to the tomb to continue their faithfulness and their service to Jesus, to anoint him as was proper, because it was done in a very hastily manner on Friday after the crucifixion. And again, The atmosphere in Jerusalem was still much of enmity and hatred toward Jesus. The disciples themselves, having abandoned Jesus, hid themselves in the upper room. But yet, the myrrh-bearing women boldly and bravely went out to anoint Jesus. We see in their example, brothers and sisters, service and faithfulness in the face of adversity. Likewise, they didn't worry about any obstacles. We hear how they ran to the tomb, and only when they were approaching the tomb, it hit them. Wait a minute. There's a huge rock in front of the tomb. How are we going to move it? How are we going to be able to fulfill our tasks? But the rock, the stone, was already rolled away because Jesus had already risen from the dead. And the myrrh-bearing women, because of their faithfulness and their service in the face of adversity, were rewarded to be the first to behold the risen Christ. The first. All of us, brothers and sisters, we hear this. We hear the joy that came to the disciples and the myrrh-bearing women. We hear how the angels appeared to the myrrh-bearing women, to Mary Magdalene in the tomb, and said, Jesus isn't here. And how Jesus himself appeared to Mary Magdalene. We hear how this joy moved them up beyond imagination, beyond description. It moved them to preach. It moved them to go out and proclaim the good news. It transfigured their entire lives because they beheld the resurrection of Christ. And we hear all this, and we may think to ourselves, I would like the same. I would really like to feel that same joy. I thirst to feel that movement of grace in my life. I too would like to base my entire life, all my actions, all my priorities, on the joy of the resurrection. What can we do? We see in the example of the myrrh-bearing women, brothers and sisters, we are likewise called to provide service and to exhibit faithfulness, even in the face of adversity. That adversity may come in various ways. It may come in sickness. It may come in sorrow. It may come in threat of loss of income, loss of respect. Certainly, we are here today because we do not follow the mode. We do not follow what everyone else is doing today, either sleeping in, or buying their groceries, or going to the mall, or sitting on the beach on the day of the resurrection, on the Holy Sabbath. We do not follow what the other people do, just like the myrrh-bearing women didn't follow the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They even broke away from the example that the disciples provided. They didn't abandon and leave Jesus. And so in the face of all this, brothers and sisters, we too are called to serve. We are called to serve in the face of loss. If we don't have enough resources or strength or energy, we are still called to serve and to be faithful. And when we serve and are faithful in the face of all kinds of adversity, we too may behold the resurrection. Last week, we heard how St. Thomas doubted and how he was granted to behold Christ after his resurrection. And Jesus said to him, "Blessed are those who have not seen, but believe. And having heard that, brothers and sisters, last week, and having heard today's gospel reading about service and faithfulness, we understand that our call is to be faithful. And in faithfulness, we are blessed. Faithfulness in the face of difficulties. The stone did not prevent the myrrh-bearing women from saying, it's not worth it. We have to wait until someone can move the stone. How many stones are in our life? How many obstacles can we think of? First and foremost, not to come to church, let alone not to follow the commandments with all of our heart, not to pray every day, not to fast when the church tells us to. We can think of many stones that lie in our way. And how do we strive to move them? We make excuses for ourselves. And then our faith grows weak and dim. And we hear today's gospel reading, and it just gives us wonder how this could be so. Saint Seraphim of Sarov, we know his life very well, how he prayed 1,000 nights and 1,000 days on the rock, spent years and years in the wilderness in prayerfulness, and returned back to the monastery to offer much support and help and wisdom. And all of his life of faithfulness and service, he was moved by the resurrection. Most of us, when we see each other, we say, hello, good morning. Saint Seraphim, whoever he met, no matter what time of year it was, he said, my joy, Christ is risen. Radost moja, Christos voskres. The resurrection moved him so that every minute of his life was transfigured because of it. Even now, brothers and sisters, from Pascha until the Ascension, the first words out of our mouths when we greet each other should not be, hello, good morning, how are you? Christ is risen. And it's not a formality. It's meant to instill in us that joy that should move our thoughts and our movements and our words and our deeds. So that the first thing that comes out of our mouth when we see each other is the joy of the resurrection. That's when we will behold the joy of how the resurrection changes our life. In the face of adversity, sickness and sorrow, loss, we can have that joy. And that joy is transfiguring. That joy is uplifting, is our strength, is our foundation. The Apostle Paul says, if there is no resurrection, then our preaching is in vain. There's nothing. We, as Orthodox Christians, base all of our life on the resurrection. We base how we raise our children on the resurrection. Our priorities, our values, our plans, all center around the resurrection. That when we depart from this life physically, we pray that by the mercy of God will be granted inheritance of God's heavenly kingdom. And so we plan our entire life, whether it is 20 years or 100 years that God gives us on this earth. We plan all those years based on that anticipation, based on that hope, based on that promise that Christ gives to all the faithful, that we will live forever in his heavenly kingdom. And therefore we don't run around after vain things. We don't foolishly spend our time or our resources on things that are fleeting, here today and gone tomorrow. Rather, we search all of our life for the one true joy, and that is communion with God, the joy of the resurrection, and the grace that God gives us by virtue of our baptism. So, brothers and sisters, let us strive to serve and to be faithful in the face of all kinds of adversity, difficulties, loss, obstacles. With God's help, we can overcome. With God's help, we can behold the resurrection. With God's help, and our commitment, we may be granted to, even in this life, behold the joy of the resurrection. So when we hear the message of the gospel on how the myrrh-bearing women, in the face of fear of death, in the face of adversity, were vigilant about service. Everything, all their life, that was the most important thing, was to serve Christ, to serve God, and to be faithful to Him, to trust in His word. And they were granted the joy of all joys. O Lord, grant us the joy of the resurrection. O Lord, open up our eyes, strengthen our faith, soften our hearts, enliven us with thy grace, so that we too, like the myrrh-bearing women, may serve and be faithful to thee all the days of our life, and so that we may behold the resurrection.